The man known to history as King Athelstan of England was most likely born sometime in the year 893 or 894. We have no record of his birth, but one of the most important accounts of his life does note that Athelstan was about 30 years of age when he ascended as King of Wessex. This occurred in the summer of 924, so extrapolating from this, Athelstan must have been born around 893, 894, or possibly 895. His name derives from the Germanic words "Aether," meaning noble, and "stan," meaning stone. So Athelstan effectively meant noble stone. His father was Edward, a son of King Alfred of Wessex, a kingdom which dominated southern England in the 9th century and which was the bulwark of the Anglo-Saxons against the Danes, who had conquered so much of Britain in the second half of the 9th century. Alfred was the first Anglo-Saxon ruler to organize a stout defense of his realms against the Norse invaders, and is known as Alfred the Great in recognition of this and his strengthening of the Kingdom of Wessex. He would die in 899, when Athelstan was just a child, upon which Athelstan's father became King of Wessex. He is referred to in the historiography as Edward the Elder. The identity of Athelstan's mother is not completely certain. Edward the Elder had several consorts, and his marital status was at times questionable. Some historians have asserted that Athelstan's mother was the first of these consorts, a woman by the name of Ecgwin, of whom virtually nothing is known. The evidential basis for even this assertion is very tenuous, as she is not named as Athelstan's mother in any sources written prior to the Norman conquest of 1066. As such, the only evidence for affirming Ecgwin as Athelstan's mother comes from 2 centuries after his time of birth and may not be reliable. What is clear is that Athelstan had numerous siblings and half-siblings from his father's other relationships with at least 2 other consorts named Elfled and Edgithfu. Athelstan was born at a time when Britain was mired in conflict and change. Back in the Iron Age of the first millennium BC, Britain was a patchwork of dozens of Celtic tribes known in this region as Britons that controlled small patches of territory. Much of the island had been united under Roman rule from the mid-1st century AD onwards, although the Caledonians of Scotland never succumbed to Roman control. Britain was one of the only areas of the empire which experienced a strategic withdrawal when the Romans pulled their legions out of the country in 410 AD, as they sought to stop the Western Roman Empire collapsing altogether on the continent, as waves of Germanic and Asiatic tribes crossed the Rhine and Danube rivers into Rome's territory. Thereafter, Germanic groups, of which the Angles and Saxons were the most numerous, had invaded Britain and carved out their own polities. In the course of the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries, numerous such states rose to control large stretches of Britain, corresponding roughly with modern-day England, notably Mercia in the 8th century, while Wessex emerged as a major power in southern England in the 9th century, expanding into the English Midlands at the expense of a declining Mercia. Although Athelstan's grandfather, Alfred the Great, is often labelled as the first king of England, in reality it would be the 10th century before a fully unified and secure English state emerged. Therefore, Athelstan was born into the royal house of Wessex, though at a time when the rulers of Wessex were self-consciously trying to present themselves as having a claim to rule all of England. This situation had been enormously complicated in the 9th century by the arrival of what are often, somewhat inaccurately, called the Vikings. The Norse people who began expanding out of Scandinavia towards the end of the 8th century went by many names in different regions, notably being called the Rus in Eastern Europe and the Northmen or Normans in northern France. But in England, they were typically called the Danes. As elsewhere, the Danes had first been content to engage in raids against England and then take their loot and slaves back to Norway and Denmark, but from the middle of the 9th century onwards, they had begun settling in and taking control of large parts of northern and eastern England, establishing polities like the Kingdom of Northumbria and the Kingdom of East Anglia. The Danes are often depicted as having experienced a major defeat at Alfred's hands at the Battle of Edington in 878. Yet, in reality, Athelstan's grandfather's victory over them here a decade and a half before Athelstan was born had only served to check the expansion of the Danes and led some of their leaders to convert to Christianity. These accomplishments aside, Edington certainly did not lead to the defeat of the Danes, and much of northern and eastern England remained under the control of powerful Danish rulers for decades to come, with major implications for Athelstan's life and reign. Athelstan is accounted as one of the most important kings of Anglo-Saxon England, a period of English history that runs for 6.5 centuries. His apparent importance to English political history towards the end of the early Middle Ages is not reflected in the number of sources pertaining to his life. In contrast to the reign of someone like his grandfather, Alfred the Great, there are very few detailed medieval accounts of Athelstan's life. By far the best source on his life and reign is the Gesta Regum Anglorum, or Deeds of the Kings of the English, a lengthy study of the kings of Anglo-Saxon and early Norman England written by the 12th century scholar and monk William of Malmesbury, a figure who is widely regarded as one of the great historians of medieval Europe. Were it not for William's work, for instance, we would know virtually nothing about Athelstan's youth, while he also provided the most detailed study of his reign. Admittedly, William was writing 2 centuries after Athelstan's life and reign. However, it is clear from his work that he was utilizing other sources from the 10th and 11th centuries that are now largely lost, and which would have provided testimonies about Athelstan's reign from people who lived through it or within living memory of it. William of Malmesbury's work is supplemented by an eclectic array of other source material that sheds light on Athelstan's time. The Durham Liber Vitae, a confraternity book of the 9th and 10th centuries, provides details of events in northern England during his time. The Mercian Registers are a short series of annals which relate to the Mercia region of the English Midlands and northwest of the country during Athelstan's father's reign. These invariably comment on Athelstan's subsequent time as king and the political background of England in the first half of the 10th century. The Liber Eliensis, or Book of Ely, is a 12th century chronicle of the history of the Ely region in Cambridgeshire between the 7th and 12th centuries, which contains bits and pieces of information on Athelstan, while there is also the material evidence that archaeologists have dug out of the ground over the years and the material culture of coins, relics, and buildings from Athelstan's time that lie in museums and libraries today. Nevertheless, there are still considerable gaps in our knowledge concerning Athelstan, and, as we will see, the greatest battle that he fought, and which has secured his reputation of one of the country's foremost medieval monarchs, is so mysterious in many ways that historians are unclear as to where it was even fought. Indeed, such is the pottered nature of the information available on Athelstan's life and time as king that the first full biographical book on him was only published in 2011, a very peculiar scenario for an English monarch, most of whom have been the subject of dozens of books over the last century or so. Historians were simply reluctant until recent times to try to reconstruct Athelstan's life. Such was the lack of material from which to do so. It is from William of Malmesbury that we learn that Athelstan was favoured when he was little more than an infant by his grandfather Alfred, who gifted his young grandson with valuable presents, including a cloak dyed in rich scarlet, along with a belt that was inlaid with precious gemstones. Alfred also bestowed an ornate sword with a valuable scabbard on his grandson, presumably before Athelstan even possessed the strength to hold it aloft, as the child cannot have been more than 4 or 5 years old at the time, given Alfred's death in 899, when Athelstan was just 5 or 6 years old. It was also to his grandfather that Athelstan owed his education. Alfred the Great was more than just an effective military commander. He was also one of England's first scholar kings, and had patronized a court inhabited by some of the finest scholars of the age. It was under some of these, many of them church figures who continued to inhabit the royal households of Alfred's sons and daughters after his own death, that Athelstan learned Latin and other subjects in the late 890s and into the 900s. Coins and royal portraits provide highly stylized versions of Athelstan's appearance, though we learn from William of Malmesbury that he was slightly smaller than the average height of those times, and so not much above 5 foot, while he had a thin frame and fair brownish gold hair. Although a scholarly education certainly had its merits and would inform Athelstan's reign and government in years to come, there was still nothing more significant in medieval times for a ruler than to be able to effectively lead his followers into combat, particularly when Britain was still as bitterly divided as it was in the early 10th century. Despite the lionizing of Alfred's victory at Edington in 878 by historians of the Victorian era anxious to see in his engagement the first flushes of the English nation, the reality was that Athelstan's father faced all of the same challenges which Alfred had. Edward controlled much of southern England and the Midlands, but a much weakened Mercia still remained as an Anglo-Saxon rival in the northwest, with the Danes controlling the Kingdom of East Anglia north of London in eastern England, and the Kingdom of Northumbria dominating northern England. What was worse, new bands of Danes were also establishing themselves at points along the southern coast in the English Channel in the 900s and 910s. Edward responded to these threats effectively during his long quarter-of-a-century reign. He managed to root out many of the Danish toeholds in the south, while Mercia was subjugated to a large extent when Athelstan's aunt, Athelfled, became Lady of the Mercians after her husband, Ethelred, the Lord of the Mercians, became seriously ill in 909. He died 2 years later. Thereafter, Mercia continued as a client state of Wessex until 918, when it was united with Wessex, though the latter action did lead to the outbreak of some unrest in Mercia amongst the nobility there in the late 910s. This subjugation of Mercia allowed Edward to campaign with some considerable success against the Danes of East Anglia, and in 917 and 918 he conquered and annexed their kingdom. Athelstan served his apprenticeship as a military commander during these wars, campaigning in both East Anglia and Mercia in the 910s, while there is more than a suggestion in the sources, fragmentary as they are, that after his aunt Aethelflaed died in 918, Athelstan ruled Mercia on behalf of his father. By that time, he was in his mid-20s, a more than suitable age to serve his political apprenticeship. By the early 920s, Wessex was actually in a far stronger position than it had been in Alfred's time, with southern England, London and East Anglia, the Midlands and the East Coast all under Edward's rule. Only the kingdom of Northumbria in the north under the Danish king Sihtric, a ruler who had earlier been king of Dublin and who had extensive connections and allies amongst the Norse of Ireland and the Scots, held out against Wessex's hegemony over England. This was the political environment in which Athelstan would succeed as King of Wessex in 924. King Edward the Elder died on the 17th of July in the year 924, around his 50th year. Like Athelstan and so many other Anglo-Saxon rulers, his date of birth is unknown, and so we cannot be sure of his age at the time of his death. It is not at all certain that Edward had intended for Athelstan to succeed to all of his dominions. It was far more common in the early Middle Ages for kingdoms and lordships to be divided amongst the sons of a ruler when he died, and indeed the Carolingian Empire of Charlemagne, that dominated Western and Central Europe in the early 9th century, had fragmented in the century that followed, owing to its division. It seems possible that Edward had intended that Athelstan would succeed as ruler of Mercia, and that his half-brother, another of Edward's sons, Aelfwered, would succeed to the Wessex dominions. If this was the favoured arrangement, it never came to fruition, as Aelfwered conveniently died at Oxford 16 days after Edward under unclear circumstances. That there was perhaps some reluctance to accept Athelstan as ruler over the entirety of Edward's dominions is indicated by the fact that it was September 925, a full 14 months after his father's death, before Athelstan's coronation was held. The delay may have been owing to some opposition to Athelstan, which was drummed up by another of his half-brothers, Adwina, a biological full brother of Aelfwered, and a figure who seems to have had a base of support in Winchester, the capital of the Kingdom of Wessex. Athelstan eventually overcame the opposition, but Adwina would remain a rival in years to come. The early years of Athelstan's reign saw him conquer the last independent part of England, the Kingdom of Northumbria, through a combination of diplomacy and military activity. In 926, he met with King Sihtric of Northumbria in the town of Tamworth and agreed a treaty there with him whereby the Norse ruler would marry a sister or half-sister of Athelstan's, whose name is unrecorded. The marriage alliance was accompanied by an agreement concerning the respective borders of Athelstan and Sihtric's kingdoms. When Sihtric died just a year later, Athelstan attempted to claim that the agreement at Tamworth had included a provision for him to succeed as ruler of Northumbria upon Sihtric's death. He faced a challenger, though, when Guthruth, a Norse ruler who had succeeded Sihtric earlier as King of Dublin across the Irish Sea, and who was most likely a brother of Sihtric's, put forward his own claims to Northumbria. Military clashes followed in northern England, in which Athelstan emerged victorious after what seems to have been a relatively minor campaign. Guthrith would continue to pose a threat, though, from across the Irish Sea, and so would his son, Olaf Guthruthsson, after he succeeded him as King of Dublin in later years. In the short term, the victory in 927 and the incorporation of Northumbria into his territories made Athelstan the first Anglo-Saxon ruler to fully unite all of what is now England under his rule. In this sense, it was him, rather than his grandfather, Alfred the Great, or indeed his father, Edward the Elder, who should be considered the first true King of England, though clearly Alfred and Edward had laid the groundwork for the Kingdom of Wessex to unite the country and had aspired to the kingship of all the Anglo-Saxons of England. Athelstan's rise to control northern England would not go unchallenged, and the northward expansion led immediately to the birth of the border tensions which would characterize Anglo-Scottish relations for over 600 years thereafter. Although Athelstan held a gathering at Aymont, just south of Penrith, in the summer of 927, in which he succeeded in having several Welsh lords and King Constantine II of Scotland acknowledge his position as the ruler of the territories held by the Angles and Saxons since the 5th and 6th century, the lands of the Angles, or England, as soon as these other British lords and rulers had dispersed from Aymont and headed home, they began plotting against the new King of England. It was some years before minor border tensions flared up into full-scale war. This came in 934, when Athelstan was driven to invade Scotland and campaigned all the way north to the northeast, where a separate Norse kingdom ruled the coastal regions and the Orkney Islands. He then headed back south after devastating the countryside, burning crops, and sacking villages in a brutal campaign of scorched earth. The conflict was not over, though, and there was a growing alliance now of the Scots under Constantine and several Norse powers, and the Danes, such as King Olaf Guthruthsson of Dublin, preparing to launch a combined attack on Northumbria and Athelstan's other territories. As these tensions were growing along the northern border, there were still issues that were unresolved at home in Wessex for Athelstan. His half-brother, Adwina, had his own base of supporters in Winchester and elsewhere in southern England, ones which had seemingly resisted Athelstan's succession to all of Edward the Elder's dominions back in 924, eventually relenting the following year. Adwina had remained problematic, though, and that he had significant supporters seems clear from the fact that the powerful Bishop of Winchester was frozen out of Athelstan's government in the first years of the reign. Although the dearth of sources for the reign means that we do not know what Adwina was doing in the years that followed, it is surely significant that in 933 he was forced to leave Wessex owing to what a set of French annals called a, quote, disturbance in England. He took ship to leave the country and died thereafter. Later sources claim he was shipwrecked at sea. However, it is now speculated that the cause of his death was rewritten in later years, and that rather than being killed at sea in a storm of some kind, Athelstan actually had his half-brother killed. The timing suggests that Adwina had possibly become a focus of discontent and plotting against Athelstan. Perhaps he had been in contact with Athelstan's enemies in Scotland or across the Irish Sea in Dublin, and the king decided to rid himself permanently of a rival who had been a thorn in his side for many years? It is impossible to know for sure. The threat which the growing alliance of the Scots and Norse lords of Scotland, the Orkneys and the Irish Sea region, posed to Athelstan and his newfound dominance of northern England came to a head in 937 in what must surely rank as one of the most important, but mysterious battles in English political history. Historians agree that the Battle of Brunanburh was every bit as important as Alfred's victory at the Battle of Edington over half a century earlier in establishing a united England broadly under Anglo-Saxon control. For instance, the Annals of Ulster, a lengthy set of Gaelic annals focusing on Ulster in the north of Ireland over a period of 1100 years, though relating events across the Gaelic world including Scotland, refer to Brunanburh as a, quote, great victory for Athelstan and a, quote, lamentable and horrible battle for Gaelic lords like King Constantine of Scotland. As such, it is clear Brunanburh was an era-defining clash. However, nobody knows exactly where it was even fought. Many historians assume, given the identity of the antagonists and the fact that control of Northumbria was the main point of contention, that it occurred somewhere along the modern-day Anglo-Scottish border. Others are not so sure and argue that the clash may have occurred substantially further south towards the English Midlands, around Northampton, or near the modern-day city of Birmingham. The latter argument is quite weak, though, as an Old English poem recounted in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, an eclectic compendium of hundreds of years of Anglo-Saxon history, states that the battle took place near the coast or a large river of some kind. No archaeological site has ever been identified to correspond to the battle, though surely a plausible candidate is also the northwestern region of England around Liverpool, north towards Blackpool, as one brief account of the battle notes that one of the Norse contingents that fought in the battle were able to make a hasty retreat back across the Irish Sea to Dublin in the aftermath of it. The location of Brunanburh may be contentious, but the result isn't. Armies of an unknown size squared off against each other. Athelstan's Anglo-Saxon forces, which must have included a sizable contingent of Danes who were second and third generation settlers in places like East Anglia and willing to fight for an Anglo-Saxon king, faced a coalition of Scots and Norse soldiers led by King Constantine of Scotland, King Olaf Guthrason of Dublin, and a number of more minor lords, which probably included King Owain of Strathclyde. These enemies of Athelstan's had different personal motives for resisting his expansionist policies, with Constantine and other Scots anxious to prevent any further northern expansion and, if possible, to reclaim parts of Northumbria, while Olaf believed he had a claim to Northumbria by right of his relation to the deceased King Sitric. Whatever ambitions they might have had soon vanished. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that Athelstan won the greatest victory that the Anglo-Saxons had ever achieved on British soil in over 4 centuries since their first arrival. The Norse of Dublin fled back across the Irish Sea, and their allies dispersed northwards, leaving Athelstan in uncontested control of Northumbria for the remainder of his reign. It was not just in Northumbria that Athelstan expanded his dominions, or at least aspired to. His reign also marked a significant step towards a King of England putting forward a claim to Wales. The people of Britain today are used to the island being divided politically into the distinct countries of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, albeit ones which are politically united as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But this was not always the case. The Celtic Britons of pre-Roman Britain would have made no such distinction between England, Wales, and Scotland. Instead, the idea of a distinct Scotland emerged as this was the portion of the island the Romans never conquered, while it was also heavily Gallicized by Gaelic Irish settlers from the north of Ireland in late antiquity and the early medieval period. in contrast to the lands further to the south. Wales's independent political identity came about largely because this part of southern Britain was not conquered by the Angles and the Saxons in the 5th and 6th centuries, while some of the Anglo-Saxon lords of the early medieval era, notably King Offa of Mercia, began building earthwork defences across the region where the border between England and Wales lies today. The most famous element of this is Offa's Dyke, erected in the 8th century, large stretches of which are still visible in the landscape along the border. The Cymry people here gradually began developing a distinct identity west of Offa's Dyke, which would become known as Welsh identity over time, with its own distinct language. Despite these developments, the geographical proximity of Wales to England, with its very long border, made it somewhat inevitable that once an Anglo-Saxon ruler had united England in the manner which Athelstan did by 927, that he would try to impose his rule over Wales. Signs of Athelstan's ambitions were seen at the council he convened at Aymont in 927 to have the other lords and monarchs of Britain acknowledge his control over Northumbria. Several Welsh lords, such as Hull of the West Welsh, were present at this gathering, and to Athelstan's mind, it could have been viewed as more junior lords coming to acknowledge his suzerainty over them. A further separate meeting between Athelstan and the Welsh lords was held at Hereford in the English West Midlands, near the Welsh border, later in 927. Here, Athelstan's claims to influence in Wales were made more expressly clear when Hull, Owain of Gwent, and a number of other major Welsh lords agreed to pay an annual tribute to Athelstan, while lords such as Idwal, King of Gwynedd, who had not been present at Aymont, also submitted at Hereford. Exactly why they did this is unclear, and the lack of source material prevents us from fully determining what happened. The fact that Athelstan subsequently took hostages in the form of younger sons and relatives of these Welsh lords to be raised at his court in England as a guarantee of their future obedience clearly indicates they entered into these vassalage agreements unwillingly. Perhaps Athelstan had campaigned against the Welsh in the mid-920s, forcing them to acknowledge him as their overlord, and details of these military ventures are simply not recorded in the handful of medieval chronicles which briefly cover Athelstan's reign. Whatever the circumstances of how it came about, Athelstan's partial subjugation of the Welsh lords in the 920s and the manner in which he had campaigned militarily into Scotland in 934 led to a growing belief in him as not only the king of a united England, but also in his ability to exercise imperium, or imperial rule, over all of Britain. In line with this, he consciously tried to present his claim to be ruler of a united Britain to the world as his reign progressed. In the mid-920s, shortly after he had become King of Wessex, Athelstan is still described in charters and other royal documents that have survived as the King of the Anglo-Saxons, the same title his grandfather Alfred and father Edward had generally used on royal documents. Yet, from 927 onwards, the titles which he used on charters and other documents demonstrated his growing claims to not just rule England, but all of Britain. Some use the Latin term Rex Anglorum, meaning King of the English. Others go beyond this to use the phrase Rex Totius Britanniae, King of all Britain, though other documents equivocated more, and Athelstan had himself defined in these as King of England and Guardian of Britain, an ambiguous title which acknowledged that he only controlled England but aspired to exercise a form of imperial rule over the entirety of Britain. This is an enormously important development. The kings of England for centuries to come, particularly so in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, would aspire to universal rule of Britain. There is a direct line between Athelstan's actions in this regard and the reign of King Edward I in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the English monarch who finally conquered Wales and nearly Scotland as well. There were other distinct new elements to the way Athelstan ruled. He expanded the convening of witans, or councils. These had been used by various Anglo-Saxon monarchs since the 7th century, but they were being more systematically used as a way of governing by Athelstan's time. The size of the witans convened by Athelstan and the frequency with which they met have led some historians to suggest that Athelstan was an important figure in the development of what might be considered to be an embryonic parliament in England. This probably goes too far. The likelihood is that Athelstan and his father Edward before him had simply expanded their dominions so significantly in the 910s and 920s, effectively adding Mercia, East Anglia and Northumbria to the territories, that it was necessary to convene ever larger witans and more frequently in order to hear the grievances of local lords and officials and allay the possibility of regional revolts and disturbances. If the expanded use of witans and royal councils by Athelstan was simply an expediency designed to ensure that the lords of his realms remained peaceful and obedient, there was nothing piecemeal or half-hearted about the manner in which he sought to centralize power at his court in Winchester through the use of legal and administrative instruments. One of the most important elements of this was through the increased use of royal charters. Royal charters had been used throughout Anglo-Saxon history, but in contrast to the general lack of histories and chronicles on Athelstan, there was a pronounced increase during his reign in the number of royal charters that were issued. Furthermore, studies of these have identified clear literary connections in terms of how they were being composed, and that they must have been the work of a handful of anonymous scribes who were employed by Athelstan at Winchester over a period of years, pointing towards a growing chancery or embryonic civil service of a kind at the court there. Similarly, while coins had been issued by Athelstan's Anglo-Saxon predecessors in Wessex, Mercia and elsewhere in England for centuries, Athelstan was a master of their use for political purposes. It was from the coins that Englishmen and women used for trade and commerce in the 930s that they read the words Rex Totius Britanniae, King of all Britain, next to the side profile image of Athelstan, telling the king's subjects that he now aspired to the rule of all of Britain. Few people would have been literate enough to understand the words themselves. However, their meaning would have been shared by those who could. The charters that were being issued by Athelstan's government point towards his concern for a wide range of legal issues that were facing England in a time of growing government activity. For instance, the Ordinance of Dunseat was issued to regulate legal jurisdictions along the border with Wales, while there were also a wide range of laws on local issues for regions like London and Kent issued in Athelstan's name. A sign that government was expanding and its range of concerns growing greater was seen in the issuance of an ordinance on charities which sought to regulate the manner in which poor relief was offered by the religious houses and other institutions. Some of this legislation when it came to things like the laws around theft and the collection of local taxes, would influence English law for centuries to come. It is understood that the Archbishop of Canterbury, Wulfhelm, may have been the intellectual driving force behind some of these new pieces of legislation. Nevertheless, the fact that Athelstan was willing to champion them and introduce them as new laws during his reign attests to his dynamism as a ruler. As much as these developments point towards a more centralized and powerful state developing under Athelstan, the reality was that any early medieval kingdom had only limited abilities to exercise control over a large state stretching from Northumbria in the north to the English Channel in the south, and from Cornwall in the west to the Wash on the North Sea on the east coast. Athelstan consequently had to rule through a number of powerful local lords known in Anglo-Saxon England as ealdormen, from which the modern municipal title of alderman derives. Some of these ealdormen could be immensely powerful figures who effectively ruled their localities on behalf of the king. It would be premature to describe Athelstan as ruling over a feudal lordship. That would only come later through Norman culture, but it is necessary to note that Athelstan, as powerful and significant a monarch as he was not an autocratic king in the shape of a 17th or 18th century ruler of an absolutist monarchy like France or Russia. He was always reliant on close relations with figures like the ealdormen to retain control over such a large kingdom as the one he had built by the 930s. While unfortunately we know very little about Athelstan's personal life and the nuances of his character, we do know that he had a more cosmopolitan outlook than his predecessors. Athelstan was the first Anglo-Saxon ruler to develop a foreign policy which purposefully sought to develop ties between the royal house of England and some of the leading royal lines and noble households of continental Europe. He did so by organizing a series of marriages between his extended family members and other European rulers. For instance, in 926, he received an embassy from France which proposed a marriage alliance between Hugh of Neustria and Athelstan's half-sister Edhild. The marriage alliance that was negotiated included the gifting of several holy relics to Athelstan, the collection of which was a personal obsession of Athelstan's. 4 years later, Edgith, another half-sister of Athelstan's, was married to Otto, the future king of Germany. Hence, there was a deliberate policy followed by Athelstan designed to cultivate links to the royal houses of France and Germany and leading lords therein. It was not simply marriage alliances that characterized Athelstan's foreign policy. His court also became a centre of intrigue for individuals with interests in the kingdom of the Franks and elsewhere. Back in 922, 2 years before Athelstan succeeded his father, his half-sister Egithyu, who some years earlier had married Charles the Simple, king of the Franks, arrived back home in England with her and Charles's young son Louis. The circumstances were that Charles had been removed from the throne in France and had his throne usurped by Robert, Count of Paris. Edgithyu had returned home not only looking for aid to support her husband's cause, but that of her son Louis. Athelstan allowed Edgithyu and Louis to remain in England after he became king, and his court became a regular haunt of Frankish nobles who wanted to support Charles the Simple's cause. That became Louis's cause from 929 onwards, when Charles died, and from that date onwards, Athelstan was effectively supporting his half-nephew's claim to the title of King of the Franks. Louis had many supporters, chief amongst them the Margrave of Neustria, Hugh the Great, who in 936 paved the way for Louis to return to France and claim his father's throne. It was the beginning of an alliance between the Frankish state and England, as Athelstan contributed towards a fleet which King Louis sent to reduce some of his more unruly lords in the Flemish sections of the Low Countries in 939. Other visitors to Athelstan's court in the 930s from the continent included lords of northern France who were being displaced by the Norse settlers there, in a portent of England's future issues with the Normans across the English Channel. Athelstan's foreign policy when it came to the monarchies and states of continental Europe centred on marriage alliances, and these entirely revolved around his half-siblings and their offspring. This was because Athelstan did not marry himself. Nor is there any evidence that he entered into concerted marriage negotiations at any time, and he was clearly an intentional bachelor. Most historians of late Anglo-Saxon England agree that Athelstan's decision not to marry was owing to his clear religious piety and a desire to remain celibate. The various chronicles and annals mention that he was unusually religious, and this accounts for his not marrying. He almost certainly didn't have any children out of wedlock either, although there is one curious stray reference in the Book of Ely to Ely Cathedral as having received gifts and a financial bequest of some kind from a daughter of Athelstan's. The most likely explanation for this erroneous statement is that the compiler of the book, which was produced in the 12th century, some 200 years after Athelstan's time, mistook one of his half-sisters or a niece for the king's daughter. Athelstan's religious fervour was symptomatic of an era of growing Christianity in England. This was part of a religious reform movement which had begun under Athelstan's grandfather and which continued into the 10th century, part of which was owing to a strand of thought known as millenarianism, which perceived that the approach of the year 1000, the millennium anniversary of Jesus' birth, might augur the second coming of Christ. Athelstan's religiosity led him to patronizing numerous monastic abbeys and institutions. For instance, he founded new abbeys, those of Milton Abbas in Dorsetshire and Michelney in Somersetshire being the most prominent. Other existing religious houses that benefited from his largesse included Malmesbury Abbey. Given that the main chronicler of his reign, William of Malmesbury, was a monk here 2 centuries later, we need to bear in mind that William might have been inclined to present an overly positive account of Athelstan in his portrayal of the king and his accomplishments as a monarch who had patronized Malmesbury Abbey. More broadly, Athelstan was at the centre of the Benedictine reform movement of the 10th century, one which sought to revitalize the Benedictine order that dominated monasticism in early medieval Europe, but which was perceived as having become overly worldly and materialistic by the 10th century. Athelstan and other monarchs of the time called for a return to a strict adherence of the 6th century rule of St. Benedict, a guidebook which laid down clear strictures concerning monastic behaviour and observances. One of the most curious elements of Athelstan's reign and character, and one which was intimately connected to his religious piety, was his role as a relic collector. His interest in collecting ornaments which were associated with saints, and even with Christ himself, was so great that it was known internationally. William of Malmesbury tells us about a letter which he claims to have seen from the prior of an abbey in Brittany in northwestern France, written to Athelstan in which he noted his awareness that relics were, quote, dearer to you than all earthly substances. This is confirmed by other sources which note that Athelstan hired individuals whom he sent to travel around continental Europe in search of religious relics that could be acquired and brought home to England. Some of the figures involved were leading clerics, including the Bishop of Worcester, Kenwald, who visited Germany on business of this kind. Amongst the most famous of the relics believed to have been acquired were the Holy Lance, or Spear of Destiny, the weapon which was said to have been used to pierce the side of Jesus crucified on the cross by a Roman soldier who wanted to confirm that he was, in fact, dead, as well as the sword of Constantine, a blade which was believed to have had pieces of the true cross embedded into the hilt. The authenticity of such relics is, of course, dubious. There were many different versions of the Holy Lance floating around Europe in medieval times, and enough pieces of the true cross to have made up a small forest. These two relics were allegedly deposited at Malmesbury Abbey, where they acted as major attractions for religious tourists and pilgrims, while other churches and abbeys received equally peculiar relics acquired by Athelstan, including the alleged arm and crozier of St. Samson, who was believed to have played a prominent role in Christianizing Brittany, Cornwall, and parts of Wales in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. Following in the footsteps of his grandfather Alfred, Athelstan patronized the development of a learned court where scholarship played an important role. All of this followed in the vein of the Carolingian Renaissance, a movement fostered by Emperor Charlemagne at his court in Aachen in western Germany in the 790s and 800s, when he had sought to restore learning and the arts in a way not seen since the demise of the Roman Empire. While England was not yet producing indigenous scholars of the likes of William of Malmesbury, who in the 12th century was believed by some to be one of the most learned men in Christendom, Athelstan's court did become a haven of expatriates from Europe who came to write and work at Winchester, evidently being offered generous terms by the English king to relocate. The fragmentary details of them indicate, based on their names alone, that several were Germans, though some were also Norse, notably the Icelandic poet Egill Skallagrimsson, who must have visited England at least briefly, as a few lines of a poem he wrote in praise of Athelstan have survived. The most accomplished of all the scholars who came to Athelstan's court was undoubtedly Israel the grammarian, a figure of shadowy origins who may have hailed from Ireland, France, or Germany, but who had spent many years at Rome establishing himself as one of the foremost scholars of 10th century Europe. A polymath who dabbled in poetry, philosophy, religious commentary, literature, and even wrote a treatise on an obscure medieval board game called the Game of the Gospels, he was one of the few individuals at that time in Europe who was an accomplished Greek scholar and knowledgeable of the Greek religious philosophy called Neoplatonism, a movement which had emerged in late antiquity and which in many ways influenced the early Christian church. Athelstan's patronage of a learned court and activities as a relic collector extended to acquiring a library of valuable books and manuscripts which he then donated to leading religious houses around England. Books were an enormously valuable commodity in early medieval England, particularly vellum copies of the Bible, where they were copied out ornately. The provenance of some of these indicate they were acquired from religious houses in the Low Countries and other parts of the continent by Athelstan, often after being copied out over a period of years by skilled scribes. A common theme running through several of the manuscripts associated with Athelstan is that they featured stories of St. Cuthbert, or dedications to the saint. Cuthbert was an Anglo-Saxon saint associated with Lindisfarne Abbey and the Northumbria region of northern England in the 7th century. Athelstan was particularly keen to associate himself with Cuthbert and even visited his shrine in 934 while heading north to campaign against the Scots. His intention in doing so was almost certainly to create a public association between himself and a saint that was so intimately connected with Northumbria, the better to assert his right to rule over northern England. The last part of Athelstan's reign, in the relative peace that followed the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, was spent largely devoted to these religious and scholarly pursuits. He was particularly keen to ensure that England's monastic houses and abbeys were following the religious reform trends that were being actively pursued on the continent, and Athelstan's relic hunters in Germany and elsewhere, such as Bishop Kenwald, were also charged with observing the reforms that were taking place in the Benedictine monasteries which they visited and stayed at in their travels. Hence, Athelstan's religious program extended beyond the mere collection of relics of dubious authenticity or elaborately produced manuscript books to real tangible changes to the organization and management of the Church in England in a way which impacted on the daily lives of his subjects. It was a sign of how successful his construction of a unified kingdom, which stretched from Northumbria to the English Channel, had been that Athelstan was able to devote his final years to something other than warfare. It would, however, prove all too brief a period of peace for England. Athelstan died while in Gloucester in the core of his Wessex dominions on the 27th of October 939. He would have been in his mid-40s, hardly an old age, though advanced enough by early medieval standards that it may have been owing to a fairly normal illness, and there is no suggestion that his premature death was the result of any foul play. His burial broke with the pattern which had been established for several centuries by rulers of Wessex and the West Saxons, in that he was not interred at Winchester. This was the old capital of Wessex and the royal centre where most kings have been buried for several centuries, and where the remains of many are still found in bone chests today, lying on top of stone screens just above the main nave of the cathedral. Instead, Athelstan was laid to rest at Malmesbury Abbey in Wiltshire. He may have been seeking to break with the traditions of his ancestors who had been rulers of Wessex and to establish a new tradition for the kings of a united England. William of Malmesbury provides an unusually detailed account of his burial, no doubt enthused by Athelstan's patronage of the abbey he himself was a monk at 2 centuries later, describing how the many relics which Athelstan had acquired during his reign were carried before his coffin as he was entombed at Malmesbury, while many funerary goods of gold and silver were laid to rest with him. Athelstan's death cast open the succession question. As he had grown older and not married or had children, this had become more and more pressing, and a general consensus had developed around a favoured candidate, despite the fact that with many half-siblings, nephews and cousins, there were numerous potential candidates. The figure who was chosen from amongst these was Athelstan's half-brother Edmund, or Edmund, born to Edward the Elder and his younger consort Edgifu. Born around 920, Edmund was old enough by 939 to be able to assume the throne uncontested. The change of monarchs presented an opportunity for Olaf Guthrusen of Dublin who, despite the setback at Brunanburh 2 years earlier, retained ambitions to claim control of Northumbria and crossed to northern England to assert control over the region when news arrived to him of Athelstan's death. Hence, despite Athelstan's best efforts, Northumbria quickly fell out of the control of the Anglo-Saxons following his death and would only be reclaimed gradually in the 940s. The events immediately following Athelstan's death highlight the fluctuating nature of the politics of England over the century that followed. A strong ruler like Athelstan could unite England under his rule, but once strong, centralised Anglo-Saxon kingship disappeared, there were always Scottish, Welsh, and Norse or Danish elements willing to take advantage of the situation. Such was the case in the mid-950s, when the kingdom was divided between Edmund's sons, Edwig and Edgar. Decades of internal struggles in the second half of the 10th century allowed for a resurgence of the Danes in England, and by the early 11th century, new contenders had arisen to rule England, some hailing directly from either Denmark or Norway. Indeed, such was the ongoing nature of the Danish influence over Britain that in 1016, a young Danish warlord by the name of Canute or Cnut was able to establish himself as King of England. He subsequently succeeded to the thrones of Denmark and Norway in 1018 and 1028, making England just one piece of a composite North Sea empire. All of this points to the fact that while Athelstan was able to unite England for a time under Anglo-Saxon rule, the threat posed by the Danes and other Norse groups never fully subsided until the Norman conquest of England from 1066 onwards brought a unifying power to the country. When it did, they were also Norse to a large extent. The Normans might have come to England from northern France, but they were ultimately the descendants of Vikings who had settled along the lower reaches of the River Seine in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, right around the time that Athelstan was growing up and preparing to succeed his father. There is no denying that King Athelstan was one of the most important early rulers of England. Along with his grandfather Alfred the Great and his father Edward the Elder, he was part of the critical process between the mid-9th and the mid-10th centuries whereby the Kingdom of Wessex in the south of England united modern-day England under Anglo-Saxon rule by conquering Mercia, the Kingdom of East Anglia, and the Kingdom of Northumbria. He achieved this largely by 927, and then confirmed his control of the north of England through victory in the decisive Battle of Brunanburh in 937, a reign-defining military clash which we have surprisingly few details about. And he wasn't vital just in terms of unifying England and having a claim to being the first true king of England. He also laid down immediately upon uniting England the claims to universal rule over Britain, which the kings of England would exercise for centuries to come, seeking to overawe the Welsh lords in a manner which prefigured the English conquest of Wales in the High Middle Ages and claiming a British imperium over Scotland. Further afield still, he began the process whereby England entered into marriage alliances and dynastic relationships which would create entanglements between England and countries like France in centuries to come, while domestically he laid down the roots of the creation of England into the most centralized and effectively administered kingdom in Western Europe by the 12th and 13th centuries. In short, while we are frustratingly hampered by a lack of detailed sources for Athelstan's life and reign, there is no denying from what we do know about him that Athelstan was one of the most important Anglo-Saxon monarchs in England prior to the Norman conquest. What do you think of Athelstan? Is he one of England's underappreciated kings only because so few sources for him have survived, or due to a lack of significant accomplishments as monarch? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.